Zirkle, and I'm the co-coordinator of the Wage Peace Campaign for the American Friends Service Committee. And really glad to have you all here tonight. Of course, it's an odd occasion for many of us to mark the decade of war, the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the Iraq War. And many of us have been working together over the last decade. And it's a moment in time that had enormous consequences for people all over the world. I feel like we've probably spent the last decade, I was thinking about it today, and I was like, we spent the last decade counting. We were counting the numbers of US soldiers who were killed and wounded. We were counting the numbers of Iraqi civilians who were killed and wounded, the number of displaced Iraqis, the number of veteran suicides, the trillions of dollars that were spent on the wars, and the money that isn't being spent in our communities because it was being spent on the military budget in the wars. And it was like we did all this counting to somehow try to grasp the enormity of what had happened when the war started. And it was almost like we couldn't do it, but we kept trying to through our actions and through all this counting. But we've been left with a legacy of lost and broken lives here and in Iraq that I think we'll be really coming to terms with for decades. But another thing that happened that's a good legacy is that we had a movement that really was pretty amazing. And we can count the numbers of people that were in the streets on February 15th, 10 years ago. It was an incredible worldwide outcry against this illegal war. And we can count all of the times that we are out and stopping Lakeshore Drive, that we were in the streets in DC and here and everywhere, and the relationships that we built and the work that we've done together. And I think another legacy is that the confluence of the war and the economic crisis really made clear for people the connections between militarism and politics and the economy and racism. And these things are very clear to people now in communities in Chicago when we have to close schools and mental health clinics, but we have 60% of our discretionary budget going to the military. People see that those things are connected. And people see that using armed drones in Pakistan is very connected to the idea of using surveillance drones here in communities and here in the US. So we see, the militarism in our schools. The school-to-prison pipeline is also connected to the militarism in our foreign policy. So I think the political moment for me right now is that we're at this incredible crossroads where we can really start to work cross-constituency, cross-movement. We need to not be talking to ourselves, and I think that's what tonight is about. We're really trying to say we're going to pull all these disparate threads together and hear how the war is changed, the changing face of war across the world. And we're going to really try to work with labor, with the environmental movement, with the economic justice and racial justice movement, not just the peace movement. We're not going to just be talking to ourselves. And that's what tonight is about, and I hope that's the challenge for us moving forward. So I think without any further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Hatem Abdaya. And Hatem is a familiar figure to many folks, I know. He's with the U.S. Palestinian Community Network, and he's a leader in the Palestinian community here in Chicago. And he's one of 23 anti-war activists in the Midwest who are the target of a grand jury investigation for anti-war and international solidarity work. So welcome, Hatem.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you all again for coming and the wonderful panel that we have for you tonight. We are commemorating 10 years, but a number of people in this room were around in 1991 when the first invasion of Iraq happened. So in reality, we might be commemorating 22 this year, 22 years of devastation and the beginning of what we would consider the new world order in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. The devastation of sovereign nations like Iraq, later on Libya, threats against another sovereign nation, Arab nation, Syria today, threats against the sovereign Iran, unlimited unstopped, unchallenged war by the U.S. empire on the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the whole world. But we have been fighting against that agenda for 22 years and way longer than that. And tonight, hopefully, is the beginning of, reconstituting this movement in Chicago and rebuilding it and continuing to fight against this new and changing face of war that Mary described. I want to thank the co-sponsors, the Anti-War Committee, the American Friends Service Committee, the Eighth Day Center for Justice, the American Muslim Alliance in Illinois, the American Muslim Task Force in Illinois, the Pakistan Federation of America, the Pashtun Jargah of America, my organization, the one I'm representing tonight, the United States Palestinian Community Network, Iraq Veterans Against the War, the Chicago and Indiana chapters, Veterans for Peace in Indiana, and Chicago Area Peace Action. Thank you all for coming tonight and for organizing this event. And one of the things that I think is something that we count on in Chicago and we try to make happen all the time as well is to incorporate culture into our political work. So I want to introduce a friend of mine and his wonderful daughter. They're going to play a little bit of music for us, Heidi and Ramon Marino.
So the first song that we're going to sing is called Solo le pido a Dios. It's in Spanish, and it's all I ask to God, and then like ... It's not a complete sentence, but the phrases are asking things to God for having to do with war, and those are the lyrics if you speak Spanish or if you can figure something out from reading it. The main verse says, all I ask is that the war won't be indifferent towards me. It's a big monster, and it stomps really hard on the earth and on all the poor people, all the poor innocents of the people. And so that's the one that's repeated most often. Solo le pido a Dios que el dolor no me sea indiferente, que la reseca muerte no me encuentre vacío y solo sin haber hecho lo suficiente. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A big hand. And we're lucky enough to have Heidi and Ramon play a few more numbers throughout the evening. But right now I'd like to introduce my coworker and dear colleague, Peter Lems, who is also the co-coordinator of Wage Peace, because we do it together. And Peter has a long history of activism and has traveled extensively in the Middle East region and is currently leading our effort on drones. So he's here to talk to us about that. Peter Lems.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here, and it's you know, it's a bitter legacy, but I'm glad that we're taking the time to think about what's next, because what worries me the most is that when we think back to moments of, you can't hear me? Is this better? Oh, okay. Perfect, thank you. So I'm glad we're taking a moment to reflect, because in my mind, the land wars might be over, but the symptoms and the militarism that push them have not diminished nearly enough. And I think one of the reasons we had such a tough time as a peace movement feeling success over the last 2 decades, particularly with the war on terror, is that we have not seen any of those sunset clauses that were supposed to be triggered with the authorization for the use of force, with the USA Patriot Act, and with all these sort of laws that we now live with. And I think it's made the ground we stand on a lot weaker. I'm going to cheat a little bit. We had an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer yesterday, and there's a copy back there that I hope you'll all pick up, so I won't have to repeat what we said. But in essence, as Hatem mentioned, the Iraq War is really 3 phases. There was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the U.S. imposition of the most comprehensive economic sanctions in history. There was the U.S. invasion in 2003, and for Iraq and countries of the region, there'll be decades of recovery in the aftermath of those 2 wars. And so please look at the op-ed. That's something we've been thinking about. And I want to talk mainly about drones, but also just to put forward some ideas that, you know, land invasions, hopefully, seem like something that's not going to happen around the corner. But we are still fighting that is continuing to exasperate people's low opinion of the United States, and certainly making the region, the Middle East region, less safe. And so these administrative means, it's a different way of building higher walls, a different way of having a bigger military. But in the end, we as a country still feel that we can override international law, that we can make regime change where we see fit, and we can kill people we don't agree with, regardless of where they are. And that's reflected in our priorities. The Pentagon budget is 20 times as large as the money we invest in diplomacy, what I consider the State Department, U.S. aid, and support for international organizations. 20 times as large. And so we have a foreign policy that clearly is militarized, but is also dependent on a military intelligence complex that really ignores sort of the traditional foreign policy establishment. And that's a terrific danger. And so that plays out that under the new administration, while many people had great hope for some of the ideas that President Obama had, operations have increased in Afghanistan, aggressive sanctions against Iran have been imposed, armed drones and kill lists are escalating, we've engaged in military intervention in Libya, and we remain the world's largest weapons supplier. So there's a lot of work to do. Armed drones, I think, are what a lot of people are looking at right now as an issue that we should all be finding ways to engage with. The month of April is designated as a month of action by a drone network that already exists. So it's called No Drones, and you can get some details from them. And they're focusing on 3 actions: on the manufacturers of drones, on the research institutions that are designing these things, and the bases from where they're being controlled from. There's also, we have some unlikely allies in that the UN Commission on Human Rights announced last month that they are going to do a 9-month investigation into the use of targeted killing from drones, and that they've chosen 29 incidents, and they're going to investigate 3 countries, the 3 countries that primarily use drones. That's the United States, the United Kingdom, and Israel. And they intend to publish their findings in September. So I think we have something to look forward to as a way to carry forward a campaign. And the reason I think a campaign on drones in particular doesn't get to the whole system of militarism, but it perhaps is an opportunity to put a lid on a very, very dangerous technology. We hear drones being talked about in the United States right now in sort of a unique fashion, that they are very precise and that they're targeting people affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They might be in Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Pakistan, Afghanistan. There's a lot of countries that we are using drones against. The reason it's dangerous is right now we are the leader in drone technology, and there are no rules to monitor or control how that weapon's being used. So as other countries, this is the idea of proliferation, as other countries start to have drones that are armed and are able to fly across borders and kill people they don't like, we very much set up a Wild West scenario. And that's a scenario that can easily be based on the precedents of what the United States does. And so looking down the road, what would we say as a country if, for example, the government of China decided to use an armed drone against somebody that they did not like, who was in India or was in Tibet? That's what we do right now. Other countries have chosen not to, but there's an opportunity, I think, for us to have a very targeted campaign around their use. Now, it's not just the military that likes these, and this is the other part of drones I think we have an opportunity to work around. One of the gifts, one of the agencies created that doesn't have a sunset clause after 9/11 was the Department of Homeland Security. And what they do is they have a large trust fund, a lot of money. And what they do with that money is that they're giving it to state and local governments around the country to militarize their police force. So in Chicago, for example, I was here for the NATO march. When you look at the police and wonder why they look like they're all have riot gear and they have all these fancy equipment to control crowds, well, cities are able to get grants to get that kind of money from Homeland Security. So there's a push from Homeland Security. There's also a push around something called fusion centers, where state, local, and federal, as well as contracted people are doing spying in different areas of the country. And so they've set up 15 of these fusion centers in order to monitor people in the United States more. And where they're going now is that they are offering funds so that local police departments can purchase drones. And so part of the challenge is that these are things that are being pushed out by the federal government on local and state authorities who might be enticed by having their own force of drones. So I want to end and just say one thing that we're starting to do is we're designing a paper on reimagining foreign policy. So as we look at the lessons and what was useful in our efforts to end these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we might actually have an opportunity to have a foreign policy that moves away from fear and aggression, which dictates everything, and moves towards affirming human dignity. And I think the models are out there. I think as we think about the Middle East and the U.S. regime change through invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you consider that the Middle East, sort of, the opposite is the success of the Arab Spring and the people-led movements for change. And so, you know, we have lots of people to work with, and perhaps the worst legacy of these wars is we don't have enough partnerships with civil society folks that we've left behind.
Thank you, Peter. And after the panelists have all spoken, we're going to have an opportunity to have a discussion and a Q&A session with folks from the audience as well. So think about your questions now. It'll be very tightly moderated, and I hope that we can continue to talk about rebuilding this movement here. Our next speaker is going to talk about the effects of war here in Chicago. When we raise the slogans of money for education and money for healthcare and money for our residents here in Chicago in the United States instead of for war. This is manifested by what all of us probably have to acknowledge is the most exciting, the most militant movement in Chicago today is the campaign for a trauma center at the University of Chicago hospitals. And Southsiders Together, Organizing for Power, and the young woman who's here with us tonight from Fearless Leading by the Youth are the leaders of this great campaign, and she's going to talk about that a little bit here. Victoria Kreider, please give her a...
Hello, everyone. I go by Tori. I'm from Fearless Leading by the Youth. And the reason I'm here today is because, like, dude, I'm mad. I'm, like, so mad. It makes my blood boil when I see taxpayers' money fund a pointless war. How we, the community, us who are living in this country, voices and opinions aren't even taken into consideration. It's a war in Chicago. The death rate over here is much more greater than it is in Iraq. Why? Why is that so? Why are we dropping dead in Chicago? I'll tell you why. Because these greedy, self-absorbed corporations don't care about our lives. They don't care about nothing but how to get richer and richer. They want war because it makes a profit. But healthcare for the South Side? No, not at all. They want money for warfare, but not healthcare. We need our healthcare. We need trauma centers on the South Side because as a 17-year-old, I'm tired of seeing death. I'm tired of waking up not knowing if my time is up. I'm tired of crying mothers and families who've lost someone dear because corporations don't believe in profit over people. And I'm sick and tired of eyes not wanting to see and ears not wanting to hear. Because I've personally seen and heard, and I will not take it anymore. Me and Fly, we're going to get what our community needs. Whether those big corporations and the biggest idiot of all, Rahm Emanuel, like it or not. why we have our Trauma Center campaign, because we lost someone. We don't want to lose anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really well put. We need a Southside Trauma Center industrial complex, I think, before we can get what we want. Excellent work. Thank you. One of the coalitions that AFSC works with here in Chicago is the Move the Money Chicago Coalition, and we had a great event on Valentine's Day outside Durbin and Kirk's office, asking them to not break our hearts and cut all the programs that are being cut under sequestration. And that was a great example of peace groups, labor groups, community groups coming together in this ask. And our next speaker, Vince Emanuel, was part of that program. Vince is with Iraq Vets Against the War, and he's the Northwest Indiana chapter president. He served 2 tours with the U.S. Marines in Iraq, and he's also a host on the program Veterans Unplugged. Will you please welcome Vince Emanuel.
So I'm assuming that most people here are against the wars. I'm assuming we don't have to go through why these wars are bad. And I was explaining to my friend Allison when we were coming here that in some ways, 10 years later, it's almost as if it's like being in a band trying to play like your original album. It's like, all right, now I'm going to talk about something that I haven't talked about. I've been involved doing this work for 7 years now. When I was 18, I joined the Marine Corps, I think in a very ignorant fashion, as a lot of Americans do. And then others, I think also there's economic needs, there's healthcare needs. It's very nuanced, and I think we should talk about that as well. But my father was right. I mean, he told me right away, he said, Vince, you know, are you crazy? You know, my dad was from the Southeast Side, he comes from an Italian background, some bookmakers, some steel workers, some iron workers. My great-grandfather was in the Little Steel Strike in 1937. His best friend had a .38 revolver shoved in his mouth by a Chicago police officer, and he was asked whether or not he was a communist. My dad was in Grant Park in 1968. So that background was there, and although I was a smart, know-it-all 17-year-old, I still ended up joining the Marine Corps because I knew better than my 60-year-old father. When I was in the Marine Corps and when we were in Iraq, to talk about this 10 years later, initially it was cathartic. You know, I was doing events with Iraq Veterans Against the War. I came home and would talk about my experiences in Iraq, and a lot of it is very brutal. I mean, we tortured people. We shot at innocent civilians. We'd play around with dead corpses and take pictures with bodies. My best friend from Tinley Park, his name was coincidentally, Kevin Clark from Tinley Park, as we used to call him. A good Irish kid from the South Side. And, you know, we picked up his body after watching half of his brains and lungs fall out of his chest cavity. We used to drive around in the streets and, you know, run over these dead bodies that would have, you know, decapitated heads on the back of them, and people would be taking pictures and some people would be throwing up. That's what's going on right now. I know, I mean, believe me, there's a lot that I would like to talk to. I'd like to talk about the military-industrial complex. I'd like to talk about capitalism. I'd like to talk about labor. I'd like to talk about the prison-industrial complex. I'd like to talk about racism. I'd like to talk about misogyny. I'd like to talk about global warming. There are 1,000 issues. There's 1,000 issues that I would like to talk about, but I thought in this capacity, on this anniversary, I didn't want to prepare anything. I just wanted to get in a space with a bunch of people that I actually really respect. The first time I got emotional in a while at one of these. There's not a lot of folks out there who are remembering this event. Even some folks within IVAW give me crap sometimes, and definitely many of those I served with, when I often tell people that the reason I'm against these wars in American empire and American imperialism is not because necessarily what it's doing to our troops, and it's not necessarily because of what it's doing to our citizens. It's because I saw what it was doing to the people of Iraq. And I know that it's not only doing that to the people of Iraq, but it's doing that to the people of Palestine, to the people of Syria, to the people of Libya, to the people of Pakistan, to the people of Afghanistan, to the people of Guatemala, to the people of Honduras, and we could go on down the line. So what I would suggest... So what I would suggest when we're talking about this, we're trying to talk about, as many have mentioned, how do we rebuild this movement? I think we have to be very clear that America is an empire. We can no longer go at this and say, well, now we're against this invasion or meddling in Syria. Well, now we're against Libya. Well, now we're against this. No, we are against American empire. We're against the idea that America has 1,000 bases around the world and tries to control what the rest of the world does. And the more we frame it in that fashion, I think the more we'll get along with folks. I think the more folks will understand that. And I think if you put it in a historical context, people also understand it. Obviously, we don't need to tell people around the world. Talking about drones, and this I think is a little more technical too, I think we need to be ahead of the game here. I think it's not just drones. We have to talk about robotics technology. Technology is not simply going to stop if we indeed stop the policy of using drones. The Pentagon right now is working on weapon systems that include nanotechnology, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. By 2025, according to the Army, half of the armed forces will be autonomized, robots, by 2025. That's what the future looks like. The future looks like drones that are the size of mosquitoes and bumblebees. The future looks like drones that are going to operate much like what James Cameron produced during the Terminator films. As a matter of fact, when James Cameron was producing the Terminator films, he went to DARPA and asked DARPA, hey, could we look at some of what you're producing? He came back and subsequently said in 1992, they were working on things that we never even thought of using in the Terminator movies. This was 23 years ago now, 20 years ago. So I think, again, we need to be ahead of the game, and we need to not just oppose drone technology, but American empire. How does that connect to American capitalism? I know we're not going to have anyone here necessarily who's going to talk specifically about the climate. But look, folks, I don't know how much more serious I could be with this topic. Almost a year ago, a day before my birthday, NASA's top climate scientist, James Hansen, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called Game Over for the Climate. What he said was that if the Keystone XL pipeline is produced, and if we go through the remaining natural gas and coal deposits that are on the Earth right now, that at some point in the near future, we will have reached carbon levels that exceed that of the Pliocene era, which was 2.5 million years ago. During that period, sea levels were 50 to 60 feet higher than they are right now. That's the context that we should all, I think, keep in mind. So if I'm talking to people who are already committed, and if I'm talking to people who are already doing this work, I've asked myself, have I done enough? Have I been arrested? Have I stood there and gotten my ass kicked by a police officer? Have I stood there in solidarity with my brothers and sisters who are getting their asses kicked by police officers? I've thought to myself, and I've talked to Michael Applegate about this, my friend in IVAW, why haven't I sat? And I'm not saying that this is what people should do or that this is what would work. But I think to myself, how committed am I to this? Am I willing to put my life on the line the next time an issue comes up, or if indeed we're going to work as a movement to stop American empire and American imperialism abroad? What am I willing to do for that? Am I really willing to give up my life for that? How much of my life am I willing to give up for that? I know the people I look up to gave their lives. When I look up to people like Malcolm X, when I look up to people like Martin Luther King, look up to people like Gandhi. And part of what Gandhi said was that if you weren't willing to stand and get your head cracked, or if you weren't willing to stand with me and march smilingly and willingly, quote, into a hail of gunfire, then I don't want you marching with me. I know those are high standards. I don't think I live up to those standards, but I look myself in the mirror every morning and I ask myself, what is it going to take to stop drones and the use of drones? How can I contribute to the ongoing campaigns? How can I challenge my friends and family who aren't involved and get them into this room? We obviously need to connect with the Latin American and African American community in Chicago, particularly within the anti-war movement. These are gigantic communities in Chicago who I don't very often see at anti-war events. And I think we need to be critical of each other. I think we need to ask, are these strategies and tactics working? Can we do more? Should we be more militant? Should we be more pragmatic? Those to me are very nuanced, sophisticated questions, and I think they dictate nuanced and sophisticated answers. I think anybody who's going to stand up here, or anyone who would stand at another event and say that this is very simple and that this process is very clear-cut, I think is telling a lie. I think that this is very complex. And I think we need to be very serious with one another and constantly challenge each other. But then also, what I've learned through working with Iraq Veterans Against the War is to create a community. I mean, I've been to activist events before where people have said, "Hey, Vince, you ready for the revolution?" I'm like, "What's your last name?" I don't even know you. They're asking me if I'm ready for a revolution, and I'm saying, well, I mean, if we have a cup of coffee, maybe first, you know. With all of that being said, and I do want to add a little humor there, but I really want to be very serious when I say that I love everyone that's in this room. I am beyond pleased and honored that 10 years later there are people who are willing to remember this event and continue to struggle and continue to work. I mean, look at the folks who are in this panel, and look at all of the folks who are out here and the kinds of work that you're doing. I honestly have to say that I'm very happy to be in this space, and I just want to share some of that love and solidarity with you.
Thank you, Vince. I just learned your last name tonight. I'm going to say a couple words about Palestine before we move on with the rest of the program. Vince mentioned it, Peter mentioned it. We all know the important connection between the issue of the liberation of Palestine and the national movement in Palestine, and the devastation in the last 22 years of Iraq, and the threats on Syria and Iran today, and how closely connected that those issues are with the issue of Palestine. The excitement and the fascination and the kind of the media interest that generated around Palestine gaining observer status at the UN has essentially worn off and doesn't really mean much today. Fatah is still ruling as the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Hamas is ruling as the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, and Israel is continuing its daily crimes against the Palestinian people. Our president is traveling to Palestine as we speak. I don't know if he's landed, but the Jerusalem Post reported that Obama's visit, they believe, pressured Benjamin Netanyahu to build a coalition government that includes actually some center and moderate forces that were not part of his coalition government in the past. When he was first elected prime minister and established his first government, we wrote an article, folks from USPCN wrote an article that was published in Fight Back news service, calling that first government of his the most right-wing in the history of Israel. And those who have studied the governments of Israel, to say it's the most right-wing in the history of the government of Israel is saying a lot. And he was prepared and building that coalition government again with the most right-wing forces in Israel today. One of those parties is led by an Israeli named Bennett, who is the son actually of an American settlers, American Jewish settlers from New York. He's developed and proposed plans to further the apartheid-like conditions against the Palestinians, pushing more and more out of Jerusalem and not allowing others to return even to the West Bank. The Israelis have been talking about how they would never allow the Palestinians to return to their homes and lands inside the 1948 territories of Palestine. This guy is saying we're not even going to let any of them return to the West Bank. His plan would also annex 60% of the rest of the West Bank, securing essentially full control over all of it, and then making Gaza essentially, quote unquote, Egypt's problem. This is one of the parties that Netanyahu is bringing into his government. This visit by the president, by President Obama, some folks think that that pressured Netanyahu to not include all of the far-right parties. So instead of 3 of the fascist parties, only 2 of them are in the coalition government now. That is the reality of what Israeli society has become. You know, there is an acknowledged peace movement there. Nobody in the Palestinian community will say there isn't, but to claim, like some do in our peace movement, that there is a strong one that is challenging, you know, this right-wing, anti-Palestinian, apartheid fascist policy against the people of Palestine, that is not really happening. So Obama's trip is being protested by the Palestinians because there also is no change in U.S. policy. Maybe this pressure on Netanyahu to build the coalition government without the entirety of it being the far right is to say we're doing that because we want forces that still believe in the two-state solution and that's a possibility. But understand, all of historical Palestine, when Israel became a state, Israel took 78% of historical Palestine. Right now, the West Bank, the way it's cut up, there is 22% of Palestine left, and even within the West Bank, there's about 12% that the Palestinian Authority actually controls. So thinking that that is a viable state with no control of water, no control of the air, no control of borders, no right of return, and continued occupation, and 5,000 prisoners, Arafat Jaradat, who was tortured and killed in prison, Samir al-Isawi, who's in his 241st day of hunger strike, and so many other hundreds who are on hunger strike because they're in prison for trying to liberate their country, for doing nothing but doing what we do in our anti-war movement every day, protesting Israeli occupation. The president's visit is not going to make any difference if U.S. policy does not change. And U.S. policy cannot change unless we continue to fight to change it. So thank you very much. It's hard to analyze Palestine in 5.5 minutes, but I gave it a shot. And now we're going to bring back our wonderful Heidi and Ramon Marino for another song.
Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone?
That was beautiful. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who many of you know. Andy Thayer is active with the Gay Liberation Network and was one of the founders of the Chicago Coalition Against War and Racism, the group that led the protests that marched on Lakeshore Drive 10 years ago. So welcome, Andy.
And I see a lot of other people in the audience who are also out there on Lakeshore Drive to your credit and continue to march in the 10 years since. This being the 10th anniversary of the Iraq invasion, I think it would be remiss of us not to say a few more words about what the cost has been and continues to be to the Iraqi people. A Brown University study just a few days ago came out and found that there were 190,000 deaths due to that war, due to so-called direct violence. And what they termed several times that amount of deaths due to other violence. A study of Fallujah in southern Iraq found that whereas several years before the wars, about 2% of children were born with birth defects, in a period between 2007 and 2010, half of all children were born with birth defects. And lest we think that the war for the Iraqi people is over, we recently learned that, according to a front page headline in the Wall Street Journal, that there is now a CIA surge into the country of Iraq, in part due to the situation with the Syrian civil war. And another headline, some 15,000 people are disappeared into secret prisons or dead in Iraq, in the new democracy that the United States set up there 10 years ago. But should we be so surprised, this country that supports the Saudi dictatorship, which invades Bahrain to crush its democracy movement? We should not be surprised by any of these facts that are happening to the Iraqi people. But what I'd like to focus on is actually a concurrent political tragedy that's happened here in the United States that unfortunately leaves us even worse positioned to fight against the next Iraq invasion or whatever country it might be. I believe that we are actually in a worse position than we were 10 years ago here in the United States, and not just due to the various laws that have been passed, the political surveillance and so forth, but I think we're politically positioned worse because, unfortunately, much of the left allowed itself to replicate in a strange way the hypocrisy that we saw with the Bush administration. We came out with an anti-war movement, many elements of which seem to be only against wars led by Republican presidents, as opposed to all presidents. And if Bradley Manning taught us anything, the wars on the rest of the world are thoroughly bipartisan. And yet, when we had things like the National Defense Authorization Act signed into law by President Obama, there was barely a peep of protest against this. When Obama escalated the wars in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, go down to Mali now, then there was hardly a peep of protest out of much of the left. And that's a tragedy, and it is an hypocrisy, and it has left us worse positioned to fight against future wars because the left, unfortunately, so much of it was seen as beholden to the Democratic Party and shown to be hypocritical as a result. And I'd like to point to other examples of ways that we could be much more effective, because I think that the strength of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s was due to the fact that it was independent of both political parties. Martin Luther King, as much as the Democratic Party today tries to claim him as their own, never endorsed a political candidate. He remained independent of both major political parties. He played them off against each other, and that was the power that gave us the mid-60s civil rights legislation. People referred to the labor movement of the 1930s. Before the labor movement was incorporated into the Democratic Party, before the second and third Roosevelt administrations, that's when we got the great wave of legislation that we enjoy today that is being eroded to this day. And we need to look to rebuilding that political independence. We need to judge people by what they do and not what they say, and learn that all the great movements in history came from below against whoever was in office. That's how we won all the great gains that are being eroded today. And as we have a Democratic president who is going to be selling us the attacks on Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security in the next few months, it is up to us here in his hometown to hold him accountable, just as we would with a Republican president. And if we don't do that, that's to our eternal shame. So I'll leave it there. I think that this is a very tragic situation for our movement, and we need to really think very clearly about this, because I think we've lost a great deal of space over the last 10 years. We now have endless wars. We now have shredded civil liberties. The point of the NDAA was that it shredded basically something that we won with the Magna Carta back in 1215, habeas corpus. That's how bad things have sunk. So we need to build a new movement, and I'll leave it at that for the discussion. Thank you.
Damn, Andy Thayer even kept it to 5.5 minutes. And the last speaker before we go into the discussion is Kate McIntyre, a young person who's making a name for herself in the anti-war movement in Chicago. She represents the anti-war committee and is leading its efforts to organize the local no drone campaign with the Boeing Corporation as its main target. Please welcome Kate McIntyre.
Thank you. Everybody's been kind of sharing memories from 10 years ago. I wanted to share one from 5 years ago. Can everybody hear me? On March 19th, 2008, 5,000, including myself, took to the streets of Chicago to protest the war in Iraq. This was my first march against the Iraq War, and as a person from a town of only 3,779 people, it seemed to be larger than I thought possible. But about 6 months later, I was stunned again when I saw 30,000 protesters in Minneapolis at the RNC of 2008. Since then, the anti-war movement has declined. Though there are many factors that have contributed to this, an important component is the withdrawal of troops from Iraq by President Obama. In light of the Arab Spring and constant Iraqi resistance, the U.S. was compelled to pull troops out as it became overwhelmingly clear that people, both at home and abroad, will not accept occupation that serves imperialist interests. While security contractors have remained, it is clear that the war in Iraq did not go the way the U.S. government had hoped. It not only failed to win the hearts and minds of people, it caused distrust and a loss of credibility. This sentiment manifested itself yet again in May 2012, when over 15,000 marched in Chicago to protest NATO. This was one of the largest anti-war marches in Chicago's history, and the largest anti-war protest in the US since Obama's election. I and many others in this room were a part of CanGate, the coalition against NATO G8 war and poverty agenda. When we began organizing, we drew on the lessons learned from the RNC protests in 2008. These protests were not merely anti-war protests. They also included groups organizing against austerity, such as the Poor People's Contingent and the Welfare Rights Committee. When formulating our slogans and projecting ourselves to the media, we focused mainly on war, but we also opposed attacks on the environment as well as economic attacks on working people. We did this because when we wanted to unite everyone who could be united against the war makers. We recognize that the 1% is causing the economic crisis and attacking working people across the US, while at the same time going to war with countries across the world for their own gain. By taking this approach, we were able to bring people to march against NATO when many of the groups involved had not heard of NATO until it was announced NATO was coming to Chicago. The march was organized mainly by anti-war groups, but we united unions, groups from the African American, Latino, and Asian communities, students, and of course, the Occupy movement. They wanted to march because since the anti-Iraq war marches when Bush was in office, we have had the greatest economic crisis in 80 years. We were able to unite people around the idea that money should be spent on jobs, education, and healthcare, not war. By doing this, we brought 15,000 people to the streets, but more importantly, we made the US and NATO, their wars in Afghanistan and Libya, their threats of new wars, and the trillions of dollars being spent on these wars, a social question. And by doing that, we delivered a blow against their ability to wage their wars. Now the Anti-War Committee Chicago is poised to inflict yet another blow on the war machine by waging a campaign against the second largest weapons manufacturer in the country, Boeing, located in the heart of downtown Chicago. When Boeing moved its corporate headquarters to Chicago in 2001, it received $63 million in tax breaks. 20 million of this came from the city of Chicago itself. This is money that could have been used to improve and sustain public schools and universities, prevent the closing of mental health clinics, and halt CTA fare increases. Additionally, of the 500 headquarters jobs Chicago gained, over 80% were filled by transfers from Seattle. Clearly, Boeing is not creating jobs or aiding the working class citizens of Chicago. It only serves the bloodthirsty interests of the 1%. But how do we see Boeing at work in the various wars and occupation that serve these imperialist interests? One horrifying example is the 2008 and 2012 sieges on Gaza, in which Boeing provided GBU-39 bombs. These bombs are made with depleted uranium. When these bombs are dropped, the depleted uranium stays in the soil for billions of years. The Palestinians who were not killed in these attacks have seen sharp increases in cancer rates and birth defects due to the uranium. In short, Boeing has contributed to the suffering of the Palestinian people and has aided Israel's brutal occupation. Boeing also makes drones that are used to spy on and help carry out targeted killings in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Mainstream news characterizes the majority of those killed in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia as insurgents. Yet this fails to recognize the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's estimate in August of 2012 that anywhere between 482 and 849 civilians have been killed in Pakistan alone. A single strike in 2006 killed 69 children. The mainstream media also fails to mention that any male of military age is automatically considered an insurgent and is thus not considered a civilian. This spring, the Navy is asking for designs for the next killer drone. Boeing is expected to propose its Phantom Ray. The Anti-War Committee, along with several organizations in Chicago, will be participating in an action on Saturday, April 6th at 12:30 at Washington and Wacker. Washington and Wacker is near Boeing headquarters, as a part of a national week of action against drone warfare. We want you all to join us and to sign our petition against drones. One of the first chants I learned when I became involved in the anti-war movement was the people united will never be defeated. Ultimately, the campaign against Boeing and the linking of economic demands at home with the call to end the wars abroad are really a way to illustrate that we here in the US and those suffering in other countries due to US imperialism share a common enemy, those who place profits before people. The forces from Occupy, as well as the NATO and RNC marches, have shown us that this is crucial in order to generate and fuel the movement. For when the people of the world are under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I'd like, before we begin our discussion, I'd like to invite Ramona and Haiti to come up and do one last song.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion true. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of men. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and the world will be as one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It really added a lot to our program tonight. Glad you guys were here. So we have about 25 minutes maybe for a discussion now, and our incredible speakers really were great on the timing. Everybody stuck to their time so that we could have this discussion, which I really appreciate. So we're going to really tightly facilitate this section and hope that you'll respect the time limits too. So here's what we would like to invite you to take advantage of their expertise and the fact that we have them all here to ask questions. So we'd like to invite questions.
So my question is that these drones, what are they used? They're used in smaller forms in civil governments in the municipalities, and also with these red light cameras. What are they able to do surveillance on us besides actually creating revenues for the city?
Kate or Peter, would either one of you like to take that?
The good question on surveillance, because that's the big issue right now. And so the debate is that President Obama said, I want regulations for drone use in the United States, and asked the Federal Aviation Agency to design the regulations. And so Federal Aviation Agency mainly thinks about commercial airlines and flights bumping into each other, but they don't have any experience on how you might regulate the use of an amazing leap in ability to surveil people. So right now there's no law. The ACLU has campaigns on a macro level around drones, and the Bill of Rights Defense Committee is also designing city council designing templates that cities can use to challenge the use of drones in their municipality. But the short answer, and you may have more, the short answer to the question is it's wide open, and that's why everyone's worried.
Buddy, I want to ask the big question about, is Iran next? What's your thinking about the Senate bill that's going through Congress right now, and whether or not Iran is going to see the same fate as Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think it would be a mistake to definitively say one way or the other, except to say that Iran already is next. There's the infamous example of the United States sanctions on Iraq, which, according to, I believe it was the United Nations, killed 1.5 million. That was under Democratic President Clinton. And when then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked if the 500,000 Iraqi children's deaths due to the sanctions were worth it, she said yes on 60 Minutes. So yes, Iran is next. It's now, even if US or Israel does not launch a full frontal attack. The people of Iran are suffering now. We shouldn't hold back our protests until the bombs start dropping.
Want to address it? No? Okay.
So first, thank you to the panel here tonight, but I especially want to thank Vince for his very impassioned words that you shared about where you are and the work that you have done. We're always told to thank service people. Well, I want to thank you for your service after leaving the war. Among the heroes that are up here, I have a very special place for the Iraq Veterans Against the War organization. Can you just tell us where you are on a national level going forward?
First of all, thanks for the kind words. We're trying to organize in a very serious way, and I think I have to sort of bounce off of what Andy said. I'm very proud to be a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War for many reasons. One of those reasons is that back in 2008, we were one of the few people who were being called lunatics as we marched around in Denver, Colorado with 15,000 other people after a Rage Against the Machine show trying to protest Obama and the Democrats, and quite literally had liberals and Democrats in the street calling us lunatics and traitors and this or that. So I have to say that I'm very proud of that. And I'm very happy that we've had, well, not being called a lunatic, but on a national level, we've had the same question that just came up. Do we have enough women in our leadership? Do we have enough ethnic diversity? Are we representing anyone on the executive board who is coming from not only those communities, but the GLBTQ communities? Is that being represented? How are we organizing? We have campaigns right here in Chicago. Not only, if you want to talk about this at length, I would suggest you come and talk to Sabrina, who's here somewhere in the room. She's back there trying to hide. And also Robert Clack right up here. They're trying to work with the nurses union here in Chicago and work with nurses within the VA system. So connecting labor and the anti-war movement. But then in a very serious way is what Kate's doing also within the context of a campaign. So we're having all of those questions. We're trying to redevelop our vision and values and mission. How do we incorporate militarism? The vast majority of the people in IVAW right now are either, anarchists, communists, socialists, radical liberals, small d Democrats. There's a lot of folks, environmentalists, so there's a lot of folks bringing a bunch of different perspectives. How does militarism and these wars and empire tie into the prison industrial complex? How do we better work with the environmental movement, particularly at a time when we know that the United States military uses more fossil fuels than any other institution in the world? So those are the things that we're trying to work out right now. And as Andy said, I think we all need to, this is the most important thing. A lot of us felt betrayed, particularly veterans who came home. I can only imagine how the people of the Middle East felt, but particularly veterans who came home and spoke out against the wars. To have everyone just sort of disappear in 2008, it broke a lot of people's hearts. And so rebuilding from that, I think, is very important, and that's what we're trying to do now.
You're up now, and then Daniel. Sir?
The lady back here said what I was going to say.
Okay.
The drone, the bill for regulating drones is up before Congress right now.
Daniel.
So I'm reading from an Associated Press article that came out yesterday. A top U.S. military commander in Europe said yesterday, that several NATO countries, including the United States, are working on contingency plans for military action to end the 2-year civil war in Syria. So my question is there an emergency response plan by this group or any coalition of groups if the United States either intervenes, attacks, either solely or as part of a NATO contingent, or whether anything like that kind of an attack happens on Iran as well? Is there an emergency response plan?
Anti-war committee people? I'll start. Okay, Peter will start, and then maybe somebody locally can.
Yeah, Kate will do that.
Yeah, thanks for asking about Syria. I think it's related. There's something really wrong if we can only see conflict through our role in it, and so I do think in some major ways Syrians are suffering for what happened in Iraq, in that the international community just seems to have a red line that as long as the government doesn't use chemical weapons, it doesn't matter how many people are killed, it doesn't matter how many refugees are created, it doesn't matter how many people are internally displaced, as long as the conflict is cauterized and doesn't affect anyone but the Syrians themselves, we won't do anything. And that's, I think, our policy right now. Of course, what we are doing is we are training militia forces, Syrian militia forces in Jordan. We are sending in weapons through Turkey. NATO is sending in missiles to Turkey and is talking about a no-fly zone. But I think it's a tragedy, and I'm not aware of the discussions that people have on the contingency and what a response looks like, but I think we should be kind of embarrassed when a response comes because we haven't done anything so far.
So I agree with everything Peter said, except for the last part. The Anti-War Committee of Chicago actually did have an emergency response to Syria when Hillary Clinton and NATO started putting threats against Syria in the summer of 2012. We were able to generate, I believe, about, I want to say 50 protesters within a week, which I found awesome. But again, as we said earlier, I'm amazed by numbers. You know, I think our consistent stance, at least for me, has been hands off Syria, you know, because I've been doing this a short while, but have studied the history, and NATO intervention has very rarely led to anything positive. So I think it's important for us to have a response that says hands off.
I know that they have drones flying over the Arizona desert. to detect people who are crossing the border. So I wondered if you guys knew any more details about like how they use drones for like border security, and just like how the like fight against drones can tie into like the struggle for immigrant rights and stuff.
That's a good quick one.
Yes, those are the only big drones the U.S. are using right now, and I think there's a definite link with immigration, with groups working around border issues. And discussions are starting, but it's going to start first and happen the worst along the borders, and largely, I would say, in the south, but they're also used along the border with Canada as well.
Young man.
Hey, I want to thank you all for speaking today, and I want to thank AFSC for bringing us here also from Louisiana. My question is, well, we used to live in a, after the Soviet Union collapsed, we started living in a monopolar world, which is like one system controlling everything, which is the American imperialist system and the capitalist system itself. Do you think there's a concrete alternative for that system that we could support, for example, China today? And if so, how could we support it? Because I believe if there's an alternative power, we can destroy the first power more easily than actually trying to work the problems in the American capitalist system. Thank you.
All right. It's a big one. Who wants it? Yeah? All right.
That's for the next event.
No, I think that's probably one of the most important questions that we all should be asking ourselves. But I also see sort of very quick.
What was the question?
The question is that we have one system running the world after the Soviet Union collapses. This is neoliberal capitalism, American imperialism, finance capitalism, whatever you want to call it. The one system. He's asking, do we think there's viable alternatives? I'm saying that I obviously do think so. But also I think we have to be very nuanced in this. And I think it has to take place within the context of what I was talking about earlier. Living on a planet and the idea that we could have infinite growth with finite resources is quite literally insane. So I want to approach that question from a very specific environmental viewpoint. Meaning, if indeed we can no longer destroy the environment like this, then even socialist experiments like what's happening down in Venezuela, and using the major resource, which is a fossil fuel, which is oil. And again, there's many positive things to be said about that experience as well. I have many good friends who have either been to Venezuela, live in Venezuela, and so forth. But again, I think we need to be very serious and critical with this and ask whether or not those alternatives can be spread across with sort of a broad brush. Are people in the South going to be able to organize in the same way as people in the North? Are people in rural areas going to be able to set up the same institutions as people in urban areas? Those for me are big questions, and I think they all have to take place within the context of global warming and ecological devastation if we want viable alternatives.
We're going to have two other speakers address that briefly.
I like that big framework, and I think the path to get there, I'm not sure we will point and see one that works better or best, but I think one of the things one way to get there would be to start holding some of the institutions accountable. And so I think that some people in the Middle East look at Turkey as a model, and that other countries don't like Turkey as a model. So I think the model actually has to come from kind of tearing down the existing system, and I think out of that comes up some sort of sense that leaders who bring countries into war are held accountable, corporations that destroy communities are held accountable, and that maybe when those steps are seen as realistic, then maybe people would believe in something else that would be better.
I'd just like to go back really quickly to Daniel's point, because I don't think we've addressed it adequately for going forward. That is, if the United States imposes a no-fly zone or does even more direct military attack on Syria, I think heretofore there hasn't been such an attack because Syria, unlike Libya, doesn't have a lot of oil. Or to take an even more extreme example, far more people have died in Congo than any of the North African countries. But that much said, the situation in Syria is getting serious enough, and there do seem to be more moves towards direct military intervention. And I would propose to this group here assembled en masse, the way we do make these decisions, that if there is a no-fly zone imposed or other direct U.S. military intervention, that we all plan to be at Federal Plaza at 5 p.m. that day, or if it happens just shortly before 5 p.m. the next day. That has been the traditional plan, and I think we should do that not just for Syria, but with our pivot to East Asia. Who knows what's happening there? That we need to be prepared as an anti-war, a peace movement going forward, and I would propose that as a general body, and I would like to get a vote of acclamation if that seems to be a reasonable plan.
All right, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege. We're going to take one more, and I'm going to take this young man because the rest of the people that had their hands up are all people that we see a lot, and you're going to have a chance to talk more. So you got the last question here, and then we're going to invite some students up from Indiana.
It's a comment and question. I am Iraqi. I was born in 1991. I was born to the first war and the sanctions, and I was there during the war on 2003. I thank everybody to be over here because you're showing love, you're showing compassion to other human beings, that their voices are not getting reached to anyone. They're getting killed or tortured every day. Thank you everyone for being here to show love, to show peace to the world, because we are the next generation to come to change the world. My question is, I saw few people in here, like compared to the world, who knows like the truth, who seeks the truth, and like I appreciate everybody for seeking the truth, because by the truth we're gonna change the world. But there's more than 60% of my colleagues, my friends all over the world don't know what's going on. And what's the truth? Do I believe the media? Do I believe the government? Or do I believe what I read, what I search, what I can like see? How can I get this message across to all of the people that I meet in the rest of my life?
That's a perfect question to end with. I'm going to give everybody a shot at a 30-second answer, if that's cool, so we could wrap up with the panel, and then we can move on to the last part of the program. So let's start over here, Vince, and then Victoria, and go down the line.
Personally, I have to say hello. First of all, I'm going to get a hug after this. I want to say I'm sorry. I also have to say that if we want to pass this message along, I think it's up to us to provide a platform for the people who have been affected by this the most, and to make sure that their voices are heard.
So one of the ways that Fly gets our message out to everyone, because we need to organize everyone or for our movement to grow, we outreach. We make flyers, we go on the news as much as we can, we go out, we get our face out there, we get our voices out there, and we try to as hard as we can to get heard. So that's one of the ways. Just don't shut up. Everybody.
First of all, thank you. I feel so much love from you. You've talked about how you feel the love from us. It's amazing to feel so much love from you. As far as how to get this message out, you talked about, do you believe what you search? I say never stop searching. Never stop trying to find the real answers, but also never stop trying to unite with the people around you. The numbers speak for themselves. When you get a large group of people together to do actions or spread a message like Victoria was talking about, it makes a difference. So thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that what we need to provide a platform, but also we need to hear the voices of what the impact of war has been. I think we can only imagine, and I think we would be we'd be a better country if there was a lot more time sort of talking to what it's like for Iraqis now after what we've done to that country. So keep talking, and we'll magnify your voice.
If you think you've figured out the truth, say it anyway, even if it's unpopular. The movement against the Afghanistan war started out with bare handfuls in this country. We now have an overwhelming majority of Americans against it. It took a long time, but it wouldn't have gotten where it is today on that if people, small handfuls, hadn't started speaking out immediately after September 11th, 2001.
And I want to just say this too, Yahui. When it comes down to it, it's the Iraqi people who are defeating the U.S. in the war in Iraq. We're helping. We're a part of the global anti-war movement, and it's important what the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era did in this country, but it was the Vietnamese that defeated the United States. So it's your people and our people who are the brave ones fighting this war against the U.S. Thank you all again for being here tonight. It was a very, very good event, I believe, and I think we've got some ideas and some energy to go forward.